Thomas Mitchell wiped the sweat from his forehead as he climbed into his old pickup truck that crisp October morning. The sun was just beginning to peek through the thick clouds that had rolled in overnight, casting long shadows across his cornfields. He had been farming this same piece of land for over 30 years, and every morning started the same way: check the crops, inspect the fences, and make sure everything was running smoothly on his modest farm. The autumn harvest was almost complete, and Thomas felt the familiar mix of relief and exhaustion that came with another successful growing season. His corn had done well this year despite the unpredictable weather, and he was grateful for that. Money had been tight ever since his wife Martha had gotten sick with cancer the year before. The medical bills had piled up faster than he could manage, and the bank had started sending notices about the farm loan. But Thomas tried not to think about those worries too much. He was a man who believed in taking things one day at a time. As he drove along the dirt road that bordered his property, Thomas noticed something unusual. There were tire tracks in the mud near the edge of his woods, tracks that definitely had not been there the day before. The tracks were deep and fresh, as if a heavy vehicle had been driven through during the night when the ground was still soft from the recent rain. Thomas stopped his truck and got out to take a closer look. The tracks led straight into the dense forest that separated his farm from the next county over. Thomas had walked those woods countless times over the years, hunting deer and checking for damaged trees after storms. He knew every trail and clearing in that forest, or at least he thought he did. These tire tracks were heading in a direction he rarely explored, toward the deepest part of the woods where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. Even on the brightest days, Thomas felt a strange uneasiness in his stomach as he examined the tracks more closely. They were made by a large truck or van, something much bigger than the pickup trucks and farm equipment that normally traveled these rural roads. The tread pattern was unusual too, not like the regular tires that most local farmers used. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. Though Thomas could not quite put his finger on what exactly was bothering him, he was about to get back in his truck and continue with his morning routine when he heard something that made his blood turn cold. It was faint at first, so quiet that he thought it might be the wind moving through the trees. But as he stood perfectly still and listened carefully, he realized it was not the wind at all. It was the sound of crying, and it was coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Thomas had raised 3 children of his own and had 5 grandchildren. He knew the sound of a child crying better than most people, and what he was hearing now was definitely the sound of children in distress. Not just one child, but what sounded like at least 2 different voices, both young and both clearly frightened or hurt. The crying was coming from the same direction as the mysterious tire tracks. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen beside his truck, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to call the police, but when he pulled out his old cell phone, he saw that there was no signal. The cell towers in this rural area were spotty at best, and they did not reach into the deep woods at all. He could drive back to his house and use the landline, but that would take at least 20 minutes round trip, and the crying sounded urgent. Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the truck, along with a bottle of water and the first aid kit he always kept in his toolbox. If there were children hurt in those woods, they needed help immediately, and he might be their only chance of getting it quickly enough to make a difference. The farmer pushed through the thick undergrowth, following both the tire tracks and the sound of crying. The branches scratched at his weathered hands and caught on his work clothes, but he pressed forward with determination. The deeper he went into the forest, the darker it became. The thick canopy of leaves overhead blocked out most of the morning light, and Thomas was grateful he had brought his flashlight. The crying grew louder as he got closer, and Thomas could now clearly distinguish 2 different voices. One sounded like it belonged to a very young child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. The other voice was slightly older, perhaps 9 or 10. Both children sounded exhausted, as if they had been crying for a long time. Between the sobs, Thomas could hear them trying to talk to each other, but he could not make out the words yet. After pushing through the forest for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Thomas emerged into a small clearing that he had never seen before. In all his years of exploring these woods, what he saw there would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. And he knew immediately that this was a moment that would divide his life into before and after. 2 young girls were chained to a massive oak tree in the center of the clearing. Heavy metal chains were wrapped around their ankles and secured to the tree trunk with large padlocks. The girls were huddled together, trying to keep warm in the cool October air. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and it was obvious they had been there for several days at least. The younger girl had blonde hair that was tangled and matted, while the older girl had brown hair that hung limply around her pale face. Both children looked up when Thomas entered the clearing, and the fear in their eyes was heartbreaking. They had probably given up hope of being rescued, and now here was a stranger emerging from the woods. Thomas could see that they were trying to decide whether he was there to help them or hurt them, and his heart ached for what they must have been. Thomas immediately dropped to his knees and held up his hands to show that he was not carrying any weapons. He spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage, the same tone he used when talking to frightened animals or upset grandchildren. He told them his name and explained that he was a farmer who lived nearby. He promised them that he was there too, to help, and that he would get them free and take them somewhere safe. The older girl was the first to speak, though her voice was barely a whisper. She told Thomas that her name was Sarah and that the younger girl was her sister Emma. They had been missing for 6 days, taken from a playground near their home while their mother was talking to another parent. The man who took them had brought them to this clearing and chained them to the tree. He had been bringing them food and water, but he had not come back for 2 days now, and they were sure they were going to die. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, unlike anything he had ever experienced before. Someone had deliberately hurt these innocent children, and that person was still out there somewhere. But his immediate concern was getting Sarah and Emma to safety. He examined the chains and padlocks that held them captive and realized he would need tools to free them. The chains were thick and the locks were heavy-duty, designed to keep the girls prisoner no matter how hard they tried to escape. He told the girls that he needed to go back to his truck to get some tools, but he promised he would return as quickly as possible. He could see the panic in their eyes at the thought of being left alone again. So he gave them his water bottle and told them exactly how long he would be gone. He also left his jacket with them to help keep them warm, even though the morning air was making him shiver in just his shirt sleeves. Thomas ran back through the woods faster than he had moved in years, branches whipping across his face as he crashed through the undergrowth. His old knees protested with every step, but adrenaline and determination kept him moving. All he could think about was getting back to those frightened little girls as quickly as possible with the tools he needed to set them free. Thomas burst through the edge of the woods and sprinted toward his pickup truck with more energy than he had felt in years. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, but it was not from the running. The image of those two frightened little girls chained to that tree was burned into his mind, and every second that passed felt like an eternity. He knew that Sarah and Emma were counting on him, and he could not let them down. When he reached his truck, Thomas threw open the toolbox in the back with shaking hands. He grabbed his heavy-duty bolt cutters, the ones he used for cutting through thick wire fencing when repairs were needed around the farm. He also took his emergency medical kit, a thermos full of hot coffee that Martha had made for him that morning, and every blanket he could find in the cab of his truck. The October air was getting colder as the morning progressed, and those girls had been outside for days. As Thomas gathered his supplies, his mind was racing with questions and concerns. Who had done this terrible thing to these innocent children? Where was the person who had chained them up, and when might he come back? How long had Sarah and Emma been missing, and were their parents looking for them? Most importantly, how was you going to get them to safety without putting them in more danger? Thomas also realized something that made his blood run cold. The tire tracks he had seen earlier were fresh, made within the last day or two. That meant whoever had taken these girls might still be in the area. The thought that he might encounter the kidnapper while trying to rescue Sarah and Emma filled him with both fear and anger. Thomas was not a violent man, but he knew he would do whatever it took to protect those children. He stuffed his cell phone into his pocket, even though he knew it would not work in the deep woods. Maybe if he could get the girls closer to the edge of the forest, he might be able to get a signal and call for help. But first, he had to free them from those chains, and he had to do it fast. Every minute they stayed in that clearing was another minute of danger for all of them. Thomas ran back into the woods, following the path he had already broken through the undergrowth. This time he knew exactly where he was going, and he moved through the forest with purpose and determination. The bolt cutters were heavy and awkward to carry while running, but he held onto them tightly. They were the key to freeing Sarah and Emma, and he would not let anything stop him from getting back to them. When Thomas emerged into the clearing again, he saw that both girls were exactly where he had left them, huddled together against the base of the oak tree. Their faces lit up with relief when they saw him return, and he could see that they had been terrified he might not come back. Emma, the younger girl, had been crying again, and Sarah had her arm around her sister, trying to comfort her even though she was just as scared. Thomas knelt down beside the girls and showed them the bolt cutters. He explained that these tools would cut through the chains and set them free, but he warned them that the cutting process might be loud and a little scary. He told them to close their eyes and cover their ears when he started cutting, and he promised that it would all be over very quickly. The first chain, the one around Emma's ankle, was thick but not impossible to cut. Thomas positioned the bolt cutters carefully, making sure not to hurt the little girl's leg. The metal was harder than he had expected, and it took several tries before the first link finally snapped. Emma jumped at the loud crack, but Sarah squeezed her hand and whispered that everything was going to be okay. As soon as Emma was free, Thomas wrapped her in one of the blankets from his truck. She was so light and fragile that it broke his heart. He could feel her tiny body shivering, not just from the cold but from fear and exhaustion. Thomas gave her small sips of the hot coffee, which she drank like it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. The second chain, around Sarah's ankle, proved to be more difficult. This lock was newer and stronger, and the bolt cutters struggled to bite through the thick metal links. Thomas had to adjust his grip several times, and sweat was pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. Sarah watched him work with wide eyes. and he could see that she was trying to be brave for her little sister. Finally, after what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes, the second chain snapped apart. Sarah was free, and Thomas immediately wrapped her in another blanket. Both girls clung to him like he was their lifeline, and Thomas felt a mixture of relief and continuing worry. They were free from the chains, but they were still deep in the woods with a dangerous person potentially nearby. Thomas helped both girls to their feet, but he quickly realized they were weaker than he had thought. Emma could barely stand on her own, and Sarah was unsteady and dizzy. They had not eaten a proper meal in days, and their bodies were running on empty. Thomas knew he would have to carry them out of the woods, at least part of the way, as he was figuring out the best way to get the girls to safety. Thomas noticed something that made his heart race with fear. There were fresh footprints in the soft dirt around the clearing, footprints that had not been there when he first found the girls. Someone had been here recently, maybe even while he was back at his truck getting the tools. The kidnapper might have seen Thomas and could be watching them right now from somewhere in the surrounding trees. Thomas tried not to let his fear show on his face as he picked up Emma and helped Sarah walk beside him. He told the girls they needed to move quickly and quietly, like they were playing a game of sneaking through the forest. He did not want to scare them more than they already were, but he also knew they needed to get out of that clearing as fast as possible. The journey back through the woods was much harder with two exhausted children. Thomas had to stop several times to let Sarah rest, and Emma seemed to be getting weaker by the minute. About halfway back to his truck, Thomas made a decision that probably saved all their lives. Instead of heading straight back to where he had parked, he took a different route through the woods, one that would bring them out closer to his neighbor's house. Frank Wilson lived about 2 miles from Thomas, and he was a retired police detective who had moved to the country for a quiet life. Thomas knew that Frank would know exactly what to do in this situation, and his house was closer than the police station in town. More importantly, Frank had a radio in his house that could reach the sheriff's department even when cell phones did not work. That as they made their way through the woods, Sarah told Thomas more about what had happened to them. The man who took them was tall and had a beard, and he drove a dark van. He had been watching them at the playground for several days before he grabbed them. He told them he was taking them somewhere far away where no one would ever find them, and he had been planning to move them to a different location soon. This information made Thomas even more worried. If the kidnapper had been planning to move the girls, that meant he would be coming back to the clearing soon. Thomas pushed himself and the children to move faster, even though Emma was getting so tired that he ended up carrying her most of the way. When they finally emerged from the woods near Frank's property, Thomas felt like they had escaped from a nightmare. But he knew the nightmare was not over yet. They still had to catch the person who had done this terrible thing, and they had to make sure Sarah and Emma got the medical attention and support they needed to recover from their ordeal. Frank Wilson was working in his garden when he saw Thomas approaching with the two children, and the old detective immediately knew something serious had happened. Thomas quickly explained the situation, and Frank sprang into action with the efficiency of someone who had handled emergency situations for most of his career. Frank Wilson dropped his gardening tools the moment he saw Thomas emerging from the woods with two small children wrapped in blankets. The retired detective had spent 25 years with the state police, and his trained eyes immediately recognized that this was no ordinary situation. The children looked frightened and exhausted, and Thomas had the expression of a man who had just witnessed something terrible. Thomas quickly explained what he had found in the woods, speaking in hushed tones so the girls would not have to hear all the details again. Frank listened carefully, asking specific questions about the location of the clearing, the condition of the children, and any signs of the kidnapper. His years of experience told him that time was critical in cases like this, and every decision made in the next few hours could mean the difference between catching the criminal and losing him forever. Frank immediately brought Thomas and the girls into his house, where his wife Helen was preparing lunch in the kitchen. Helen took one look at Sarah and Emma, and her maternal instincts kicked in immediately. She wrapped both girls in warm blankets and sat them down at the kitchen table, speaking to them in the gentle voice she had used with her own children and grandchildren. While Helen was comforting the girls and giving them small amounts of food and warm milk, Frank was making phone calls. His first call was to the county sheriff's office, where he spoke directly to Sheriff Morrison, a man he had worked with many times over the years. Frank explained the situation and requested immediate backup at his location, as well as a full search team for the woods where the girls had been held captive. Frank's second call was to the state police, because he suspected this case might involve kidnapping across county lines. Sarah had mentioned that they lived in the next county over, which meant this was likely a federal case that would require coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. Frank also called for an ambulance to check on the girls' medical condition, even though they seemed to be physically unharmed. But Frank made one more call that would prove to be the most important decision of the entire rescue operation. He called his son-in-law Danny, who worked as a helicopter pilot for the local news station. Frank explained that they needed aerial surveillance of the woods immediately, both to search for the kidnapper and to guide the ground search teams to the right location. Danny did not hesitate for even a second. He told Frank he could have the helicopter in the air within 15 minutes, and he would bring along the station's best camera operator to document everything they found from above. This aerial perspective would give them a huge advantage in searching the vast forest area where the girls had been held while they waited for the emergency responders to arrive. Frank gently questioned Sarah and Emma about their ordeal. He used techniques he had learned during his police career for interviewing child victims, being careful not to traumatize them further while gathering the information needed to catch their kidnapper. The girls were remarkably brave as they described what had happened to them. Sarah told Frank that the man who took them had been watching their family for several days before the kidnapping. She had noticed him at the grocery store where their mother shopped, and she had seen the same van parked across the street from their school. The man had approached them at the playground when their mother was distracted, telling them that their mom had sent him to pick them up because of an emergency. Emma, despite being younger and more frightened, was able to provide important details about the van and the man's appearance. She remembered that he had a scar on his left hand and that he wore a baseball cap with a logo on it. She also recalled that he had a strange smell, like cigarettes mixed with something else she could not identify. Frank carefully wrote down every detail the girls provided, knowing that this information would be crucial for identifying and catching the kidnapper. He also asked them about the location where they had been held, and Sarah was able to describe several landmarks that would help the search teams find the clearing more quickly. The first to arrive at Frank's house was Sheriff Morrison, along with 2 deputies. Frank briefed them on the situation and provided them with the detailed information he had gathered from the girls. The sheriff immediately radioed for additional units and requested that the state police send their best detectives to take over the investigation. Next to arrive was the ambulance, with 2 paramedics who specialized in treating child victims. They examined both Sarah and Emma carefully, checking for signs of physical abuse or serious medical problems. Fortunately, both girls appeared to be in relatively good physical condition, considering what they had been through. They were dehydrated and malnourished, but they had no serious injuries. The paramedics recommended that the girls be taken to the hospital for a more thorough examination and for psychological evaluation, but they agreed that Sarah and Emma were stable enough to provide more information to the investigators first. Frank suggested that they conduct the interviews at his house, where the girls felt safe, rather than at the police station, which might be more intimidating. About 20 minutes after Frank had made his call, the sound of helicopter blades could be heard approaching from the distance. Danny arrived right on schedule, and Frank used his radio to guide the helicopter to the area of the woods where Thomas had found the girls. From the air, Danny and his camera operator would be able to see things that ground searchers might miss. What Danny found from his aerial perspective was shocking and provided crucial evidence that changed the entire investigation. Hidden deep in the woods, about half a mile from where the girls had been chained to the tree, was a camouflaged campsite that was invisible from the ground. The site included a travel trailer, a generator, and what appeared to be supplies for a long-term stay in the woods. Even more disturbing, Danny could see from the air that there were multiple trails leading away from the campsite in different directions. This suggested that the kidnapper had been using this location as a base of operations for some time, and he might have been planning to bring other victims to this remote area. The helicopter footage also revealed fresh tire tracks leading away from the campsite toward a logging road that connected to the main highway. Frank immediately radioed this information to the ground teams, and Sheriff Morrison coordinated with the state police to set up roadblocks on all the major highways leading away from the area. If the kidnapper was trying to flee the region, they wanted to catch him before he could get too far away or potentially harm other children. The helicopter continued to circle the area, and Danny reported seeing movement near the campsite. Someone was there, either the kidnapper himself or possibly an accomplice. This information sent the search teams into high alert, and they began moving toward the campsite with extreme caution. They knew they were dealing with someone who was dangerous and desperate. Meanwhile, back at Frank's house, detectives from the state police had arrived and were conducting more detailed interviews with Sarah and Emma. The girls were becoming more comfortable talking about their experience, and they provided additional information that helped the investigators understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. Sarah revealed that the man who kidnapped them had made several phone calls while they were being held captive, suggesting that he was not working alone. She had heard him talking to someone about moving the girls to a different location, and he had mentioned other children who were being held somewhere else. This information suggested that they were dealing with a larger criminal operation, not just a single kidnapper. Emma remembered that the man had taken photographs of them while they were chained to the tree, and he had used a tablet computer to show these photos to someone else during a video call. This evidence would be crucial for prosecuting the case and potentially identifying other victims or members of the criminal network. The investigation was expanding rapidly, and Frank realized that Thomas's quick thinking and brave actions had potentially prevented not just the loss of 2 lives, but had also uncovered a much larger criminal operation that might have continued to harm children for years to come. As the afternoon progressed, the full magnitude of what Thomas had stumbled upon in the woods was becoming clear, and everyone involved in the rescue operation knew They were racing against time to catch the criminals before they could disappear or harm anyone else. The sound of police radios crackling with urgent communications filled Frank's house as more law enforcement officers arrived to coordinate the massive search operation. The helicopter continued circling overhead, with Danny providing real updates about the movement he was seeing near the hidden campsite. The situation was becoming more intense by the minute, and everyone knew they were dealing with something much bigger than a simple kidnapping case. Sheriff Morrison established a command center in Frank's living room, spreading maps of the area across the coffee table and coordinating with multiple agencies. The FBI had been notified and was sending agents from the regional office, but they would not arrive for several hours. In the meantime, local and state law enforcement had to handle what was clearly becoming a complex and dangerous operation. The helicopter pilot Danny radioed down with disturbing news. Through his high-powered camera, he could see that someone was hurriedly packing equipment at the campsite, apparently preparing to leave in a rush. There was definitely a vehicle hidden under camouflage netting, and at least one person was moving around the site with obvious urgency. The kidnapper knew that his hiding place had been discovered, and he was trying to escape before the ground teams could reach him. Thomas sat quietly in Frank's kitchen, staying close to Sarah and Emma while Helen continued to care for the girls. Even though the immediate danger was over for the children, Thomas felt a deep responsibility for their continued safety. He kept thinking about how close they had come to never being found, and how many other children might be in danger from this same criminal network. The girls were slowly beginning to open up more about their experience, providing details that painted an even more frightening picture of what they had endured. Sarah told the detectives that the man who kidnapped them had talked about other children he had taken before, mentioning names and describing other locations where he had held victims. Emma remembered seeing photographs on his tablet computer that showed other children in similar situations to what they had experienced. Detective Laura Martinez from the state police was specially trained in interviewing child victims, and she was able to gather crucial information from Sarah and Emma without causing them additional trauma. The girls described the kidnapper as being about 40 years old, tall and thin, with brown hair and a beard. He had a distinctive tattoo on his right forearm that looked like a snake wrapped around a dagger. More importantly, the girls provided information about the van he had used to transport them. It was dark blue or black, with tinted windows and no license plate on the front. Sarah remembered that there were tools and rope in the back of the van, along with what looked like supplies for camping. Emma recalled that the van had a strange smell inside, like chemicals mixed with cigarettes. As the detectives were gathering this information, the ground search teams were closing in on the hidden campsite. The dense forest made it difficult to approach without being detected, but the officers were using the helicopter's guidance to navigate through the thick undergrowth. They had to be extremely careful because they did not know if the kidnapper was armed or how he might react when cornered. The first search team to reach the campsite found it abandoned, but the evidence left behind was overwhelming. The trailer was equipped like a mobile prison, with chains, locks and restraints clearly intended for holding multiple victims. There were photographs of other children pinned to the walls, and a computer that would later reveal connections to a much larger criminal network operating across several states. Most disturbing of all, the officers found detailed maps of the local area with elementary schools, playgrounds, and shopping centers marked with red circles. There were also notebooks containing information about specific families, including schedules, routines, and descriptions of children. This kidnapper had been planning his crimes methodically, studying potential victims for weeks or months before taking action. The helicopter tracked the fresh tire tracks leading away from the campsite, and Danny followed them to a logging road about 2 miles away. The tracks ended at a spot where another vehicle had obviously been waiting, suggesting that the kidnapper had planned his escape route carefully and had help from accomplices. This confirmed what the investigators had suspected based on Sarah's account of hearing phone conversations. Sheriff Morrison immediately expanded the search to include all roads within a 50-mile radius, coordinating with law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties and states. Roadblocks were set up at major intersections, and officers were given detailed descriptions of the suspect and his vehicle. Every available patrol car in the region was involved in the manhunt. Back at Frank's house, Sarah and Emma's parents finally arrived after driving frantically from their home 3 counties away. Michael and Lisa Peterson had been living in absolute terror for the past 6 days, not knowing if their daughters were alive or dead. When they burst through Frank's front door and saw their children safe and relatively unharmed, the emotional reunion brought tears to everyone's eyes. Thomas watched as the Peterson family embraced, and he felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that his decision to investigate the crying sounds in the woods had led to this moment. But he also felt anger and determination, knowing that the person responsible for causing this family so much pain was still out there, and potentially planning to hurt other children. Lisa Peterson was a nurse, and she immediately began examining her daughters for any signs of injury or illness. She was relieved to find that they appeared to be physically okay, but she was deeply concerned about the psychological trauma they had endured. Michael Peterson, a successful businessman who was used to being in control of situations, felt helpless and furious that someone had targeted his family. The Petersons were amazed and grateful when they learned the full story of how Thomas had discovered their daughters and risked his own safety to free them from their captivity. They realized that if this humble farmer had not been checking his property boundaries that morning, or if he had ignored the sounds he heard in the woods, Sarah and Emma might never have been found alive. Detective Martinez explained to the Peterson family that this case was far from over. The evidence found at the campsite suggested that their daughters had been victims of a sophisticated criminal organization that had been operating for years. There would be extensive interviews, court proceedings, and ongoing investigation as law enforcement worked to identify and capture all the members of this network. The helicopter search was expanded to cover a much wider area, and additional aircraft were brought in from neighboring states. The FBI agents who were en route had experience with multi-state kidnapping rings, and they would be taking over the investigation as soon as they arrived. The local law enforcement agencies would continue to support the search, but this was clearly a case that required federal resources and expertise. As the afternoon turned into evening, there was still no sign of the kidnapper or his vehicle. The roadblocks had stopped and searched hundreds of cars, but none matched the description provided by Sarah and Emma. It was becoming clear that the criminals had planned their escape carefully and might have already gotten far away from the area, despite the frustration of not catching the kidnapper immediately. Everyone involved in the rescue operation knew that they had achieved something remarkable. 2 innocent children had been saved from a terrible fate, and a major criminal operation had been exposed and disrupted. The evidence collected from the campsite would help law enforcement agencies across the country identify other victims and potentially prevent future crimes. Thomas remained at Frank's house through the evening, wanting to make sure that Sarah and Emma were truly safe before he went home to tell Martha about the incredible events of the day. He had started that morning as a simple farmer worried about his crops and his debts, but he was ending it as a hero who had saved 2 lives and helped expose a dangerous criminal network. The bond between Thomas and the Peterson family was already forming, built on the shared experience of this traumatic day and the knowledge that his actions had prevented an unimaginable tragedy. None of them knew yet how this event would continue to impact their lives in the months and years to come. The manhunt for the kidnapper continued through the night and into the following days, with law enforcement agencies from multiple states working together in the largest search operation the region had ever seen. The FBI agents who arrived that evening brought sophisticated tracking equipment and access to national databases that helped piece together the full scope of the criminal network that had been operating from the hidden campsite in Thomas's woods. 3 days after the rescue, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A truck driver at a rest stop 200 miles away recognized the description of the kidnapper's van and called the police hotline that had been set up for tips. The vehicle was found abandoned in a parking lot, but fingerprints and DNA evidence inside connected it to Marcus Webb, a drifter with a long criminal history who had been moving from state to state for years. Webb was captured 12 hours later, at a motel near the state border, where he was apparently planning to meet with other members of his criminal network. When FBI agents arrested him, they found detailed plans for kidnapping operations in 3 other states, along with photographs and personal information about dozens of potential victims. The scope of what they had uncovered was staggering and far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. During his interrogation, Webb revealed information that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. He had been working with a network of criminals who specialized in targeting children from rural areas, believing that disappearances in small towns would not receive the same level of attention as those in major cities. They had been operating for over 5 years, moving their operations frequently to avoid detection. Most disturbing of all, Webb admitted that he had been planning to return to the campsite the very evening that Thomas had discovered the girls. If the farmer had waited even one more day to check his property boundaries, or if he had ignored the sounds coming from the woods, Sarah and Emma would have been moved to a different location where they might never have been found. The investigation that followed Webb's arrest led to the discovery of evidence linking the network to dozens of missing children, cases across multiple states. Some of these children were found alive at other hidden locations, while others had been missing for so long that the trail had gone cold. Thomas's quick thinking and brave actions had not only saved Sarah and Emma, but had also led to the rescue of other children and the dismantling of an entire criminal organization. As the weeks passed, the Peterson family struggled to help their daughters recover from the trauma they had experienced. Sarah and Emma were receiving counseling and medical care, but the healing process was slow and difficult. Both girls had nightmares and anxiety attacks, and they were afraid to be left alone, even for short periods of time. During this difficult time, Thomas became an unexpected source of comfort for the girls. They associated him with their rescue and safety, and his gentle, grandfatherly presence seemed to help them feel more secure. Thomas visited them regularly at their home, bringing small gifts and spending time reading stories or working on puzzles with them. Michael and Lisa Peterson were overwhelmed with gratitude toward Thomas, but they also learned about the financial struggles he was facing with his farm. The medical bills from Martha's cancer treatment had put them deeply in debt, and the bank was still threatening foreclosure despite Thomas's heroic actions. The Petersons felt that simply saying thank you was not enough for the man who had saved their children's lives. Without telling Thomas, the Peterson family began reaching out to their community and beyond, sharing the story of how a humble farmer had risked everything to save two children he had never met. Michael used his business connections to organize fundraising efforts, while Lisa worked with local churches and community groups to spread awareness of Thomas's situation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, donations began pouring in from people across the country who had heard about Thomas's heroic actions. Local businesses offered services and supplies. Farmers donated equipment and labor, and families sent money to help save the farm that belonged to the man who had saved Sarah and Emma. But the Peterson family had an even bigger surprise in store. For Thomas, Sarah and Emma had been asking their parents if they could do something special for the man who had rescued them. The girls had been having difficulty sleeping and dealing with their trauma, but talking about Thomas and planning ways to thank him seemed to help them feel better. The girls came up with the idea of creating a special garden at Thomas's farm, where they could visit and help take care of plants and flowers. They wanted it to be a place where they could feel safe and peaceful, and where other children who had been through similar experiences could come to find healing. Lisa, who had experience with trauma recovery through her work as a nurse, realized that this was exactly the kind of therapy that might help her daughters heal. The idea grew into something much larger than anyone had imagined. Mental health professionals in the area became interested in the concept of using gardening and farm activities as therapy for child trauma victims. Local landscapers and garden centers offered to donate plants, materials, and expertise to create a truly special healing space. 6 months after the rescue, the healing garden at Thomas's farm was completed and dedicated in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people from the surrounding communities. Sarah and Emma cut the ribbon to officially open the garden, which featured quiet walking paths, raised beds for growing vegetables and flowers, and comfortable seating areas where children and families could spend peaceful time together. Garden became a symbol of hope and recovery, not just for Sarah and Emma, but for other families who had been affected by violence and trauma. Therapists began bringing their young patients to the garden for outdoor counseling sessions, and support groups for families of crime victims met there regularly. What had started as a simple idea from 2 little girls had grown into a community resource that helped dozens of families. Thomas's farm was not only saved from foreclosure, but it was transformed into something he had never imagined. The healing garden attracted visitors from across the region, and Thomas found himself in the unexpected role of host and caretaker for a place that brought comfort to people dealing with some of life's most difficult challenges. Martha, who had fully recovered from her cancer treatment, threw herself into helping manage the garden and supporting the families who came there. She organized volunteers, coordinated with therapists and counselors, and helped create programs that used farm activities as part of the healing process for trauma victims. The bond between Thomas and the Peterson family continued to grow stronger. Over time, Sarah and Emma spent their summer vacations helping on the farm, learning about agriculture and gaining confidence through their work in the healing garden. That came to think of Thomas and Martha as honorary grandparents, and the trauma that had brought them together became the foundation for a lifelong friendship. Years later, when reporters would ask Thomas about that October morning when he heard crying in the woods, he would always give the same humble response. He insisted that he had simply done what any decent person would do when children needed help, but everyone who knew the full story understood that his actions had been extraordinary, requiring courage, quick thinking, and a willingness to put himself at risk for strangers. The healing garden continued to flourish, helping countless children and families find peace and recovery after experiencing trauma. Sarah and Emma grew up to become advocates for child safety and supporters of programs that help crime victims heal. The criminal network that had threatened so many children was completely dismantled, with dozens of arrests and convictions resulting from the investigation that began with Thomas's discovery in the woods. Thomas's simple act of investigating unusual sounds on his property had created a ripple effect of positive change that continued for years. His story became a reminder that ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference when they choose to act with courage and compassion, and that even the darkest situations can lead to hope and healing when good people refuse to turn away from those who need help.